Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to the inaugural Oxford University Press History Book Club meeting. My name is Susan Ferber, and I'm one of the history editors at OUP. On behalf of my colleagues, I'm so pleased that you have taken the time to join us today. The best part about being an editor is being able to collaborate with fascinating and creative writers to bring their ideas to fruition in book form, and then to be able to share their work from all parts of the globe, periods of history, and many different perspectives with readers. Maybe you have been craving some time immersed in the past amidst our tumultuous present and the chance to discuss that history. Maybe you have been looking for some new book recommendations or topics outside of your usual interests. If so, we're glad that you found this space. It seems apt to kick off in April in a season of spiritual renewal and celebration, since reading and talking about books at a group has a long religious tradition. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the first secular American reading circles, or conversations, a precursor to book clubs, were begun by women in homes, mills, empty classrooms, or wherever they could find a quiet space. They required little more than a thirst for literature and a desire to discuss it with like-minded individuals, talk about challenging ideas, to learn together, and hopefully to have some fun along the way. That's the spirit in which this book club was founded. What we lack in the intimacy of a small group in a living room or a coffee shop, I hope we can gain in creating a community of readers. This book club will give you the chance to directly interact with authors, as well as an opportunity to continue the conversation online with others in the book club. Every month, we will feature two OUP authors in conversation, in this case, the writer of a new book with one of our classic titles. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first book and authors today. This is the most bare bones descriptions of these historians, since we could easily take an hour just talking about their accomplishments. Thomas C. Holt is James Westfall Thompson Professor Emeritus of American and African American History at the University of Chicago. He is the author of Children of Fire, A History of African Americans, The Problem of Race in the 21st Century, and of course today's book, The Movement, An African American Struggle for Civil Rights. He is joined in conversation by Ray Arsenault, the John Hope Franklin Professor of Southern History Emeritus at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and the author of several books, but notably for OUP, Freedom Riders, 1961, and the Struggle for Racial Justice. Tom and Ray are going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then the floor will be open to all of your questions. You can start putting them in the chat anytime, and my colleague in marketing, Erin Cox, will bring up as many as she can in the second half hour. You can also go to the Twitter feed for @OUP History and start commenting on this book club using the hashtag OUP History Book Club. So welcome, Tom and Ray. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yes, indeed. Tom, I think the format is that I should ask you questions about your new book, and I want to say, first of all, I want to thank Oxford University Press for doing this. I think it's a wonderful idea, particularly when we're all cooped up in our houses and not really having kind of normal society. But let me just say at the outset that I think this book that you've done, The Movement, is really quite wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
I can only imagine how difficult it was to write. It's very difficult for historians to write short, as they say. Maybe we could start with, I'd like to begin with a question about the format. I remember 20 years ago, Paul Boyer, who's the editor of the Oxford Companion to United States History, asked me to write a 3,000-word essay on the Civil Rights Movement. And I found it to be one of the most difficult things I was ever asked to do.
Yeah.
And I got through it, but it was a challenge. And so I'm just curious about how you found this. Was there a lot of trial and error of trying to figure out what you would include and what you would leave out? And did you have any anguish over it, or did it go relatively smoothly?
Smoothly? No, I don't think so. But the book has a somewhat different origin than others that I've written. I never intended to write a book about the civil rights movement, and it sort of developed over time and out of my teaching um, that basically there was a story or part of the story of the civil rights movement that I wanted to tell. Um, uh, over the years, as I taught various classes, generations of students, beginning in the 1970s, I saw a change where their understanding of what the movement was about um, um, changed. I mean, when I first started teaching, there were a number of students who actually, some of them may have had experience in the movement, or their siblings may have been in, or parents. And that, of course, fades in time. And so what they know about it is what they either read or see on TV or how it's represented. And one of the themes that came through, well, there are two. One is often they would speak of it sort of reflecting, I think, what was in the popular media, referring to it as Dr. King's movement. Now, since that was my generation and I was involved in the movement, that really sort of grated on me because I had a different sense of what the movement was about. But then with, the celebration of Dr. King's birthday in February, or January rather, but sort of merged with the Black History Month, that became a more dominant perception of the movement. The other was the framing of the movement as somehow misdirected at public accommodations, which to this younger generation seem not so as important as, economic issues or political issues. And so that dissatisfaction, I think, was behind ultimately my accepting Oxford's offer to write a short book, which actually appealed to me. So I pretty much knew the kinds of themes I wanted to pursue and what the stories were that would, because there are many ways, as you know, to write about the civil rights movement. And by definition, I left a lot out. I have to. Actually, most books would. But the story I wanted to tell was one about, how ordinary people actually created the movement and created the leaders of that movement. And so that's what drives the narrative and my selection of the material that I wanted to discuss.
Yeah. Well, that comes through very strongly throughout the book. I think it's one of maybe the greatest strength of the book. And I want to talk about that again and maybe in a moment. But I have another question about the decisions you had to make about what to leave in and what to take out. I know I've been teaching civil rights courses since the 1970s, and I look at my old syllabi, and I sort of blithely began with the Brown decision in 1954 or the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 56, and I look at as these syllabi progressed through the years, I would go farther and farther back in time. So the last few years, I begin with the abolitionists, the early 19th century, and because I found out the students didn't really know very much about the antecedents of the modern movement. So I wonder about your decision of where to begin. I know you have a lot on the NAACP and some references back to the 19th century, but I just wonder if you had some decisions that you had to make about that.
Yeah, but actually it wasn't, because given what I was trying to do, it wasn't that difficult to determine. I guess what I did mention in my introduction of how I got into writing the book was the other theme, other than my students, was emerging from people who are, historians of the movement. And as you know, the idea of there being a long civil rights movement become a theme. which, at least the way it has unfolded over the last decade or so, I felt tended to misread the sort of classic civil rights movement, beginning in Montgomery, which is where I think it begins, and through the 1960s. But at the same time, it is quite clear that there's a long history of struggle. Certainly in the 20th century, early 20th century, people were formed by some of those struggles, people like Ella Baker and Bob Rustin and many others. But also, it seemed to me that there were events that one could highlight in the 19th century, again, period you talk about, the abolitionist movement and during the Civil War, when there were protests very similar in many cases to what we would see in the 1950s and 60s. Boycotts, street marches, so forth, sit-ins even. So, and this is a lot of this, of course, I learned as I was teaching and reading about the movement myself, as I was being educated about that earlier history. So, in a book that was supposed to be 135,000 words, I thought I would try to, capture some particular instances that will illustrate that the depth of that history, while also underscoring one of the principal themes of the book, which is that there are political, social, economic changes that make possible a somewhat more unique movement in the late 1950s and early 1960s.
Yeah. Well, I think you do a marvelous job of discussing some of those antecedents and some really wonderful material, and also very skillful the way you handle this whole question of the long civil rights movement, which I think is a challenge for all of us, since Jack McDowell Hall wrote her famous essay, and we all use the term the long civil rights movement, and but I think there's a lot of disagreement about what really the real implications are. So I thought you handled that very well. Another question I have, I think for me this is the most important part of your book that I was so pleased to see, because it fits with my own view of things, is your emphasis on well, I guess Lawrence Goodwin was the first person, I think, to use this term of movement culture when he was studying the populists of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And I think many civil rights historians have adopted that, but I think your emphasis on that, on the power of movement culture as opposed to charismatic leadership as being the driving force behind the movement. I wonder if you could talk a little more about that, about movement culture.
Yeah, of course, I, like many historians of my generation, is very much influenced by Godwin's study. The other, I guess, prequels, I guess you might say, to my writing this that I haven't talked about is that I'm a native Southerner, grew up, in segregated society, went to segregated schools, churches, etc. So that informed my outlook on this as well. And so out of that, I think the appreciation, as well as my participation in the movement, appreciation of how, again, ordinary people get mobilized, basically, mobilize themselves, how they then, in creating this movement culture, for to use the term loosely, also shape the leadership and the direction. So that's where sort of the historical theoretical, if you will, background meets, a lived experience, and shape the argument, or shape my emphasis on that particular feature.
Yeah. I was struck as I was reading your book at the outset how you use your grandmother, Carrie Lee
Yeah.
Fitzgerald, and I'm sure you must have thought about that, whether you wanted to do that or not. And I think it works extremely well. I don't want to give too much away because I want people to buy and read your book, but did that just come to you that you could use her experience as a kind of early Rosa Parks figure, almost to say a lot of things that you wanted to say to frame the book?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about that story is that it came to me relatively late, actually. I was raised by my grandmother, really. My parents, she lived with us, my parents worked. She told me a lot of stories, but she didn't tell me that story. And I learned about it later, and it stuck in my head. I mean, this after she'd passed. And so when I was thinking about how to start the book and how to put before the reader in some, what should I say, visceral, or at least, emotional, not sure I have the right word, but, to get the reader's attention focused on the main theme that was going to drive this book and this narrative, it came to me, well, grandma's story I think is the way to do that. So I didn't hesitate in terms of any kind of personal hesitancy, but it just came to me quite late. And in some ways, as I say in the forward to the book, that it sort of confirmed me that I should write the book, because I've not been, as I said, particularly thinking about writing a book on the civil rights movement. But that sort of sealed the deal, you might say.
Yeah, so it's really, in some sense, your story and your family's story to some degree. I think it's a very effective beginning, a wonderful lead, as the journalists call it. And I must say, just for a moment, I couldn't help but think about my own grandmother, who lived with my family in the 1950s, and we were in Pensacola in 1956. I was 8 years old, and I would go with my grandmother once a week at least into Pensacola from a small town we lived just outside, and she was a little tiny woman from Boston, fancied herself as the last of the abolitionists, but we would get on the bus and she would lead me to the back. We would always sit in the back, and we'd be the only whites there sitting in the back. I don't think it was mandated by law, but by custom. That's the way it was in Pensacola. Yeah. And I remember thinking, as the people stared at us, now what's going on here? I didn't understand it then, but later I was very proud of her for doing that. Yeah. It's really, I often think about that, and I thought about that when you told the story about your grandmother. Back to the substance.
Small gestures.
Yeah, tender mercies, as they say. Your handling of the connection between the sort of classic civil rights movement, the nonviolent movement, Dr. King and the others, and John Lewis and Jim Bevel and all that, and then trying to do justice to Black power and Black nationalism and the later struggles in the North. I know that must have been taken a lot of thought to put it together the way you did in such a masterful way. But maybe if you could just maybe summarize for people what you concluded there about the connection between, maybe we can call it two different movements, or maybe you don't see it that way, but.
Yeah. I guess first going back to the where nonviolence fit into the movement to begin with. And maybe in part, of course, I'm expressing my own personal orientation,
Mm.
where there was a distinction between the people, and they were incredible, courageous people who were morally committed to nonviolence as a way of life. I mean, and in fact, obviously, you talk about this in your book on the Freedom Riders, as opposed to if you're not a mass movement, you know, everybody's not on the same page quite in terms of that, but they do recognize, as I recognize, and my fellow demonstrators would recognize, that on a practical level, you know, nonviolence was the only game in town. You either were nonviolent in a demonstration or you stay home, because nothing else made any sense. And for the masses of people who participated in various movement activities, I think that was obvious. If I would then go, you know, say to my visit relatives in New York or somewhere else who this was all just on TV among Black people, there was much less understanding of, you know, what is this, you know, this nonviolence nonsense. So it's a very mixed picture, I think. It's what I try to convey, you know, that you could still be part of the movement without being morally committed to nonviolence as such. And it was a powerful theme. And I think the brilliance of Dr. King was to merge this in some ways with the Christian, you know, nonviolence, which made it more accessible and understandable, say, to, you know, regular churchgoers and people who are religiously motivated. But of course, as you know, a lot of people were not religiously motivated who were part of the movement. So, so it's a tricky theme that I think then gets, again, kind of confused later when people then compare King to Malcolm X or the Black Power theme that comes up later, and it's a lot of confusion about it. But if you began even in the you know, post-war period, and certainly by the mid-50s, people, you know, could, I think, activists could understand that they needed to pursue this struggle non-violently, even if they, in their own personal lives, did not adhere to that theory.
Yeah. Well, I thought you handled the geographic aspects of the whole problem very well, north and south, and I was so happy to see that you paid a lot of attention to the movement in the north, you know, after 1965, and I think that's one of the strongest parts of the book, really. I'm sure it was difficult, but one thing that surprised me, and I wanted to ask you about this, is that you keep making this distinction between the New South and the Old South cities, that you kind of put Nashville in the New South category, and then when we moved to Montgomery, that's an Old South city. And I've never seen it described in quite that way. Of course, we always use Old South, New South, but not with respect to the sort of geographic differences. It's Rim South versus the Deep South, and you chose to use a different language. And I wonder how that came about.
That's something that emerged over the years as I was, you know, trying to make sense of the movement myself, as I was teaching about it. And of course, in the course of that, you talk about the New South as conceived of in the late 19th century, you know. I mean, and a division, I mean, back to Steve Van Woodward and others, a division between, among Southerners, between those who were committed to progress, meaning economic progress, industrialization, all those things that were catchwords of that era, versus those who are still, committed to, well, basically plantation agriculture, but all the things that come with that. I mean, it's not simply the work regime, but the work regime shapes the social order, as you know. And as I thought about, trying to think about how, where the movement begins and how, it seems to me that was a useful way of talking about it. I mean, I was also influenced by my former classmate, J. Mills Thornton, in his book on the dividing lines, I think it's called, as he talks about places like Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma, and work that's been done on North Carolina, for example. All of it led me to think that, okay, how do you explain how this particular phase of the movement by the 50s could come about? I mean, my grandmother's story and Irene Morgan's and many others, it wasn't that people weren't angry, weren't courageous early on, but that the possibility of acting simply was not there. I mean, the conditions, and that the distinction between those cities that were divided in this way between progressive outlook and the divisions within them, as described by Thornton and others, made that possible. And so that was the use that I try to put that theme. We've lost Ray?
We lost Ray. Hi, everybody. I'm Erin Cox. So we're working on getting Ray back, but this actually is a good point. This is about the halfway mark where I was going to open it up for questions from the audience anyway. So this gives us an opportunity while Ray is trying to reconnect. This is the beauty of a live performance, is that, we deal with these
strange things happen in Florida,
So. Yeah, exactly. Good point, Tom. Good point. A couple questions from the audience that I want to ask. The first is, given the voluminous literature on the civil rights movement and noting 2 forthcoming books about Fannie Lou Hamer just this calendar year, what aspects of the civil rights movement in that historical period do you think remain underexamined and are fruitful terrain for further study?
Oh,
that's a big one.
I suspect first of all that there's been some great work done in recent decades on the movement in the North, which I draw on and really depended on. But I think there's probably more to be done there. And that would be the first thing that would occur to me as an area of that could be exploited. In terms of the movement in the South, I mean, the literature is, as Ray mentioned, very rich. There are probably always places and situations that would benefit from more examination. Because we usually think of certain, legitimately, I think, hot spots like Birmingham and Montgomery and so forth, and Greensboro and Nashville. So there may be some more revealing material if we looked at other places that are less well known.
Sorry, I had to step away to help Ray get back online. Thank you for that, Tom. Does violence have a place in the civil rights movement? You answered this a little bit, but maybe you want to delve into that a little bit. That's a question from Facebook.
Well, if you mean as a strategy, no. I mean, I think the power of the movement and the brilliance of it was to make it a nonviolent movement. Violence is a different kind of movement. I mean, you can have various kinds of revolutionary action, but that was not, I think, by anybody's calculation, plausible. Certainly then, and probably not now. Now, a different story, though, of course, is violence and self-defense, which was, in fact, part of the movement, especially in Mississippi, Louisiana, where, and I talk about this a bit in the book, where, you know, the nonviolent orientation was not plausible in areas where, what I call terrorist states, where, you know, it was outright murder, as opposed to people being beaten up by police in a demonstration in full public view. So people organized, the Diggins for Defense, but even before them, to protect civil rights workers, and you know, so if you mean resort to violence in self-defense, then of course that was a part of the movement, you know, certainly in the latter stages of it. But if you mean aggressive violence, as in a kind of revolutionary situation, which a lot of people talked about but weren't very actually doing anything about, and a lot of posturing around that, then that was not.
Right. What has the response been to the book? It's been out for 2 months now. Have you heard from readers?
January, beginning of February.
Oh, January, yes.
Well, I'm grateful that so far, so good.
That's good.
Nobody said mean things about it. Unlike some other books I've written, by this time I've been getting a hard time about one thing or another. And I'm certain that will come. But right now it has been a good reception.
Well, in keeping you know, you had said that you couldn't include everything, of course. Did anybody say, oh, I wish you'd included this, or, you know, I can't believe that was left out, or has everybody been sort of like that you selected the right things, or just curious?
I was trying to think, maybe somebody who said in passing something of that sort, but basically there's not been. I think people recognize this is a short book. It's intended for, you know, an audience that doesn't want to read 500. My last book was about 400 pages. I'm not certain how many people read it, but, you know, so it's serving a different purpose, and hopefully reaches an audience that wouldn't be reached by a much longer book. So I think people see that. Mm-hmm. Actually, some of the readers' reports, going back there, wanted me to include things, I think their particular theme or topic or event that they thought was more important. I remember somebody saying, well, you need to talk about the West Coast more. Well, yeah, but I'd have to leave out some other things in order to do that. So,
right.
So it wasn't a serious problem.
Right. Ray, welcome back.
Thank you. Sorry about the technical difficulty.
I thought you were down to the beach.
Yeah, I was a quick trip to the beach, and now I'm back. You know, I wanted just to say, jump in just for a second, that didn't get to ask all my questions, but I'm glad we're doing the audience now. I'm sure, Tom, maybe you've run into this too, that many of the very best books on civil rights are very long. I'm thinking of Taylor Branch and many others, and my own, and it really creates a problem when you're creating a reading list. And I think something like this book, I mean, I just retired from teaching, but I know if I were still teaching, and maybe I will teach again, I would use this book. Really, I think it's wonderfully accessible, and not just the length, but the way you approach the topic. There's so much in it. So it's really quite extraordinary how much you were able to fit in 135 pages. It's just astonishing, really. Not even less than that, I guess. So I think it was really needed. In some ways, I've used some of the very short introduction books from Oxford before on abolitionism and others, and I've always found them to work very, very well. It's not just to read on an airplane to get from point A to point B. It's I think it's really great for students to have something like this. So I commend you for it.
Well, thank you for that. As I said, as one who's also written long books, I was quite happy actually to do a short one, especially since I had a particular idea of what I wanted to do in it, and hopefully reach an audience that's a broader audience. So, yeah.
Definitely. A couple more questions from the audience. Do you see Black Lives Matter as growing out of the civil rights movement in some way, or as an entirely new and distinct?
I think there are a lot of links to the civil rights movement. Obviously, it's an entirely different generation. In fact, one of my former students has written a book, Barbara Ransby, on the Black Lives Matter movement, and had actually been active in it. And I think she notes some of the sort of thematic links, and I sort of draw on that in my very brief discussion or references to the Black Lives Movement. I think I'm not certain how much people who are active in it actually learn from or know about the intricacies of the social movement of the 60s, but some things repeat themselves. Maybe that's not a good framing of it, but certainly, police violence was also one of the issues driving the civil rights movement. I mean, I talk about in the book this growing urban population, and with that, in terms of the kind of controls available to the powers that be, were the police, and quite brutal treatment. So that was not talked about as much as an issue like voting and public accommodations and so forth, but that was also under the underscoring, I think, the anger that drove the movement in the 60s as well. So, and in some ways, if you think about the murder of Emmett Till, which I think most people who studied the movement, just the testimony from people who were in it, that was a catalyzing event. Well, as we've seen, there are incidents of that sort still happening. So there are parallelisms that I think that are pretty clear. But it's a new day and a new foundation, new context in which this movement's evolving, and it's not a repeat. It's not even perhaps the sequel of the 60s movement, but it does have some relationships to it.
Right. What you brought up voting, and that was a question from the audience too. New voting restrictions now in some states. How do you, through the prism of the 60s and now looking at that today, how do we react to that, and what can we do about it, I guess?
Well, what we can do about it is stop it.
Oh, yeah. Right.
But in terms of the earlier campaigns and struggles for voting rights, one can see it just in the language and the news coverage and reactions that shapes how people are thinking about this particular moment. I think to the advantage of trying to resist it and to reverse it. I mean, we'll see what happens, but you know, there's only so many times you can play the same playbook over and over again.
Right.
And the restrictions on voting, you know, that are, you know, presented as non-racial. I mean, that playbook was back in the 19th century. I mean, in the period after Reconstruction. I mean, so if you think about one of the complaints, for example, in Georgia and other places, is where the polling places are, and are they accessible? Or Texas, you know. Well, South Carolina would put polling places that Black people would have to go to across rivers and ravines and so forth that they couldn't reach, or would have to travel a day to get to. This is in the 1880s and 1990s. So, you know, there's nothing new about that. And I think that's to the disadvantage of people who want to replay that.
Right. A question from the audience. Any civil rights figures who, in your opinion, should receive greater recognition or be better known than they currently are?
Oh, I think there are many. I mean, one of the things, I guess, in some ways, that driving the thematic of the book was how many people who don't make the history books, who are unsung heroes, that really were critical figures in, you know, particular communities. Sometimes they are in the background in other organizations. I mean, somebody like Ella Baker, for example, has gotten more attention, but it was not at the time, except for people who actually work with her. So, you know, there are a number of other people of that sort. Also, one of the themes of the book, by the way, I should point out, was the role of Black women early on, that I think has gotten a lot less, because the people often standing in front of the podium speaking are men. And so the movement's perceived as these are the driving forces. When actually, if you look at it, often it was working class Black women who did some of those early sit-ins and protests and so forth and drove the narrative. So if anybody's to be recognized, I think that's one of the places you might start.
Aaron, if I could jump in here just for a
Please.
second. This makes me think of, well, when I was doing my book on the Freedom Rides, how I sort of encountered Diane Nash and got to know her quite well, and always felt that she was overlooked as a major figure. And one of the things I tried to do in my book is to bring her importance of her life career out. But as an extension of that, I spent an extra year after I finished the text of the book working on an appendix with all of the Freedom Rides, 436 of them, tracking them down, trying to figure out what happened to them after the Freedom Rides, in part because I felt I got to know them so well, and I felt so bad that most of them had been lost to history. There were just a handful of figures that people knew, and I felt at the very least they needed to be in some book as a kind of it's kind of a testament to their courage and their sacrifices that they made. And I mean, I couldn't do all that I wanted to do, but I really feel that that's one of the great problems with civil rights literature, that we haven't, as Tom does in this book so well, you know, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and that it really is a movement. You know, it's not just a few charismatic leaders standing up and telling people where to go.
Right.
Exactly.
One thing that were just sort of on the flip side of that coin, were there people who were very much active who said, I don't want to be written about. I don't want to be I don't want my name to be out there, not necessarily, but not, you know, but that were there for the cause, for the movement, but not there to be written about necessarily?
I'm not taking, well, actually, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe not.
In terms of the those kind of instances, but I think I can say that there are people who were very instrumental, certainly in local movements, who step back. I mean, they were working behind the scenes. There's a lot of work goes into,
Sure.
a demonstration or whatever kind of activity one is engaged in, certainly voter registration. And so did not push themselves forward and avoided the spotlight because, that wasn't the point. And that was I think the spirit, at least as I experienced it, of the movement. Even some of the people who do become sort of historic figures and so forth, that wasn't what it was about.
Right.
Aaron, a few years ago, we had a conference on the civil rights movement in Florida, and we invited. We thought we knew one or two people in every city who had been involved in the movement, and we tracked them down. And then they'd say, "Well, I'll appear on the panel, but you've got to have so and so," and this person is absent, and we'd never heard of the so and so.
Yeah.
And we ended up with 104 people from all over the state, from Key West to Pensacola, many of whom didn't know each other. They didn't know what they were doing in the cities, that were 300 miles away. And it was a real learning experience for us that all these faceless, nameless people who had, in many cases, devoted their lives to the movement.
That's so cool. That's really cool. I have a question. Is it hard to write history when you have a personal connection to it?
I guess yes and no. One has to be careful, I think. I guess it's a part of the discipline of a historian, or can be at least, that you always have a voice in the back of your head, sort of checking, and whether that you're writing about the 19th century and something you never were a part of, or you're writing about something that you were, that to know that your perspective is particular.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe geographically particular. So, for example, in writing this book, I was not in Mississippi. All the activity I was engaged in was in Virginia, my hometown, Danville, and then again in Cambridge, Maryland. And so I knew a lot of people, coming in and out of those places, but I was not there. In fact, my first contact with Georgia and Mississippi was when I later was working for the poverty program, working in rural poverty, seasonal farm workers and migrant workers. And that took me to some of those places. And I met some of the people, in fact, during that period. But I was in a whole different context. I was a Fed at that point.
Yeah.
So, that's part of, I think, the discipline of writing history, or writing anything, I guess, but that you recognize your own limitations, and that you need to draw on other sources to balance that out. That's, I guess, the best. Maybe Ray has some.
Yeah. What do you think, Ray?
Perspective.
Well, I often say that historians tend to like their subjects to be dead, so that they and their families aren't looking over your shoulder. I think particularly doing movement history, where you really have to be very careful about balancing the contributions of CORE and SNCC and SCLC and NAACP, and particularly like the Freedom Rides, which so many organizations were involved, and where it really wasn't an organizational part of the movement, but people remember. And if you slight New Orleans CORE, for example, which was often done in Freedom Rides, they let you know it, and they should. And another thing I think also, though, I think in my experience, people who are civil rights historians or study race or African American history, there's almost always a personal story, a personal connection, whether it's out there or not. It's sort of like the movement. You sign on for life. There's no going back. You sort of cross the Rubicon when you go into this field, and I think I think that's why so many talented people go into it, frankly, and why the books win so many prizes and are so engaging, because it has the stuff of humanity, and I think good writers can bring that out, even though, as Tom suggests, sometimes there's a real problem when you're dealing with such wonderful people to turn them into cartoon characters, stick figures that not flesh and blood human beings, and I think we always have to be careful of that. As I said, I'm writing this biography of John Lewis, who's about as close to a saint as you could find, and but I want him to remain a human and not to give another book of hagiography or anything like that. And so it's hard. We don't want to give a celebratory version of the movement, and Tom does not do that. I mean, I think one of the great strengths of this book is that he really lets the chip fall where they may. I mean, it's a real truth-telling book, really courageous. I really just admire that tremendously.
Thank you.
A question from Facebook. Can you explain the attraction of Donald Trump and Fox News to some Black voters?
No.
I agree.
Succinct. I like a succinct answer. Yes. Excellent. Ray, to go back to your point about sort of making your subjects full flesh and blood humans. Do you, when it's somebody as sort of sainted as John Lewis, do you then risk people sort of reacting to it because they have their own personal connection to this person, however real or fake it is? Is that a worry, or is that something you've experienced?
I think people are very protective of legacies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I did a biography of Arthur Ashe, who was, again, a kind of a saintly figure, and I knew people were looking over my shoulder, and I had to try to forget that and give a realistic portrayal of his life. But I think you really can't pretend that there's a moral equivalency between John Lewis and Bull Connor. I mean, it's like the whole notion of pure objectivity, I think, doesn't work, particularly in civil rights or racial history. That you have to be open and honest about your own life experiences and where you're coming from, and where your perspective, because nobody can write this history as if they're a machine. It just doesn't work. And I think so. I think the personal touch that Tom gave to it in this book is really strikes just the right balance. It's not solipsistic. It's not about him, but in some ways, between the lines, it is about everything he's encountered and read in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what makes really great history, if you can do that.
Sure, absolutely. One last question, and then I'll give you guys a chance to say sort of last thoughts. But my last question is: are there any subjects that you want to steer clear of because maybe you can't be objective, or there's some other kind of personal challenge there?
I don't think so. I mean, going back to Ray's response to the last question, I would, put it similarly, but that if I'm going to bother to write something, it's for a purpose. I mean, it's to understand it and to help other people to understand it. And I'm going to bring my values to it. I'm not going to bring the same values as somebody who believes, in oppressing people.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not. So if you want that, go somewhere else.
Yeah.
So given that, I don't think that I have any uncertainty in terms of subjects I might cover. I mean, if I'm writing about, say, a Dr. King or John Lewis or whoever, I want the whole story because that's the person. And all of us, are in the process of development over the course of our lives. We're not necessarily the same person, toward the end as we were because of our experiences, and because of other people who have influenced us.
Yeah.
So, and that's what makes it worthwhile.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why bother?
Along those lines, Tom and Aaron, I've often thought, even though you need a certain level of detachment, you don't want it to write a book that just proselytizes, certainly. But
Yeah.
I've often thought that, and I think other people maybe would agree with me on this, that to some extent, when you're writing about civil rights history, your book becomes part of the movement. In a sense, there's an ongoing struggle, and you can serve the movement not by celebrating it and pretending that it did everything right, but by recovering historic sneaking up on the truth, as one of my advisors once said, the best you can hope for. But I think it really, I like to think, and I think in my own case, the Freedom Rides, that I think a lot of the Freedom Riders see that the book, which was the first book on the Freedom Rides, is an extension of what they were trying to do, that it in a way maybe can contribute to this search for the beloved community,
Right.
by trying to tell the truth and try to, I mean, the historical actors themselves, I've discovered, often didn't know what other people were doing in the movement. They didn't have time. That's why there aren't very many artifacts. They didn't take time to write anything down or collect anything or save anything because they were too busy, fighting injustice. And they're quite amazed when they discover, when they sit down to read, all these other people were doing similar things or maybe different things. And so I think they really appreciate historians. That's been my experience anyway. But I think it is in some ways an extension of the movement itself.
Sure. Well, gentlemen, that's the end of our time together. Do you have any sort of last words that you want our viewers around the world to take away from our conversation? I'll tell them to buy the book, so you don't have to tell them that.
Well, as Ray was talking, I was recalled a line in the Jacqueline Dowd Hall article that we referenced earlier about the long civil rights movement, which was really struck me as capturing somewhat of what it's all about, and on this subject particularly, when she says, that I won't be able to quote it precisely, but basically the story of the movement, speaks to our own time. And she puts it much more eloquently than that, but and I think that's really the driving motivation. And so, basically you want the truth as best you can get to it, and that may include criticism of some of the figures, but a criticism knowing that they are operating within a space of time and context in which they don't know everything, and they're doing the best they can, and they're committed to bring about justice and change. So that would be my last word.
Yeah.
I think what I'd like to say is related to that. We used to talk a lot about finding a usable past. That was the term everybody used, a usable past. And a few minutes ago, when you asked Tom about Black Lives Matter movement, and it got me thinking, well, remembering at the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, I missed the original march, but I was determined to be there for the 50th anniversary. And I was there with the former Freedom Rider, Bernard Lafayette, who's one of my personal heroes, dear friend. And he had been asked to meet with a couple dozen of Black Lives Matter activists from Ferguson, Missouri. And they wanted to know about what lessons they could learn from the Freedom Rides and from the broader movement. And so he invited me in on this session to try to tell them what the lessons of the Freedom Rides and the movement were for them. And what I came away from that meeting, I think Bernard did too, is that I'm not sure that they learned much from us, but I think we learned a lot from them. I was just so impressed with their commitment and sophistication, and it hasn't been easy in recent years to be optimistic. And I came away from that thing feeling there is hope for the future, that it's the same spirit that I guess that Tom and I have written about. I saw in those young kids. They were just really quite inspiring.
That's so important. Thank you both for those last words and for this great conversation. It's been fascinating. We've gotten a lot of great comments on both here and on Facebook, so thank you for that. I want to thank you to our viewers from all over the world. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you are on Crowdcast, there's a little blue button at the bottom of your screen. Click there and buy these books and hear more about the book club. Our next OUP History Book Club will be May 13th, and that will center on the book The Complete Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution, with author Kevin Weddle, who will be in conversation with Benjamin Karp, author of Rebels Rising, Cities and the American Revolution. And we look forward to seeing everybody in the future. Thank you so much, Tom and Ray. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Tom. Bye, Aaron.
Bye.
Bye.